Good evening. We're honored that you're here. I don't know how well you can see me, but I was adamant about getting us off that stage we've been sitting on the last few times, and so I'm going to just jump right in. For those of you that have never been a part of one of these, they're just kind of an intensive, and we don't waste a lot of time. We just jump right in with it, not any preliminaries. We're going to make our way over to 2 Samuel 7, so if you want to go ahead and turn there, you can. We'll jump over to chapter 11 for just a little while. Matter of fact, you know where we'll go first? We'll go to Hebrews 4 first. Let's do that. And then we'll travel back to 2 Samuel chapter 7. From time to time, I like to read this as a real plumb line of what I believe Yahweh is doing in leaders in the earth. This is called the kingdom man. True success is not achieved. True success is received. Worldly men have faith in their work. Kingdom men work out their faith. Worldly men cause others to know their methods. Kingdom men cause others to know their God. The success of worldly men can be defined in certain observable methods, methods that can be cataloged, emulated, and sold for profit. The success of kingdom men is attributed to only one thing. That one thing is obedience to the spoken word of Yahweh. While that obedience may be manifested in observable acts, emulation of those acts by others will never bring the hoped-for success. Therefore, the kingdom man's success does not produce much in the way of a product that can be marketed at great prices, bringing great wealth to the man. But the kingdom man's success does cause glory to be given to Yahweh. Worldly men base their success upon information that can be cleverly edited to smooth away the rough edges, cleverly packaged, advertised, and marketed in order to bring great wealth to its author. Kingdom men know that their success is based upon uncompromised obedience to a revelation from Yahweh. True revelation is biting, sharp, provocative, challenging, an ever-present threat to the status quo. Therefore, kingdom men are almost always misunderstood, lonely, and rejected in their time, most often remaining a voice crying in the desert. They are recognized, honored, even revered, but always by another generation, never their own. Therefore, kingdom men are content to be the leaders of a remnant, the keepers of the flame, the preservers of the seed, the protectors of tomorrow's, Abraham's, Isaac's, Moses's, John the Baptist, and yes, even the Christ. No wonder that heaven and earth together cry out for the manifesting of the sons of Yahweh. 1998, F. Nolan Ball, apostle. His grandson sitting right here in the front row, so special. Go with me over to Galatians 4, and let's start there by just reading the entirety of this chapter. From there, we'll hop back to 2 Samuel. In 2017, the Lord began to show me some things in the life of David. I wrote some notes on it, and I even shared it in what we called a Wilderness Society gathering. That is now being reframed in the light of this increase in revelation regarding beloved identity, as well as the pattern of the homestead that the Father is causing to unfold before us. Galatians chapter 4, again, we're going to read the whole chapter, but it's not a crazy long chapter anyway, but it's important. Important. I'm sorry, Hebrews 4. That's what I meant. I thought that looks a little longer than I planned. And then I was like, well, I'm in the wrong chapter. Hebrews chapter 4. I come into these things, my whole being is vibrating when I come into these. Spend the day knowing we get to invest in leaders this way. It's really overwhelming. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 1 says, now God has offered to us the same promise of entering into his realm of resting in confident faith. So we must be extremely careful to ensure that we all embrace the fullness of that promise and not fail to experience it. For we have heard the good news of deliverance just as they did, yet they did not join their faith with the word. Instead, what they heard didn't affect them deeply, for they doubted. For those of us who believe, faith activates the promise, and we experience the realm of confident rest. I want to read verse 3 again. For those of us who believe, faith activates the promise, and we experience the realm of confident rest. For he has said, I was grieved with them and made a solemn oath, they will never enter into the calming rest of my spirit. Now that's a poor translation. On another occasion, we'll go back and fix that. God's works have all been completed from the foundation of the world. So it says in the scriptures, and on the seventh day, God rested from all his works. And again, as stated before, they will never enter into my calming place of rest. Again, poor translation. Verse 6, those who first heard the good news of deliverance failed to enter into that realm of faith's rest because of their unbelieving hearts. Yet the fact remains that we still have the opportunity to enter into the faith rest life and experience the fulfillment of the promise. For God has still ordained a day for us to enter into called today. For it was long afterwards that God repeated it in David's words, if only today you would listen to his voice and do not harden your hearts. Now, if this promise of rest was fulfilled when Joshua brought the people into the land, God would not have spoken later of another rest yet to come. So we conclude there is still a full and complete rest waiting for believers to experience. This is where we're going to hang our hat tonight. Whew. So we conclude that there is still a full and complete rest waiting for believers. That word rest there is the same word for Sabbath. Waiting for believers to experience. As we enter into God's faith rest life, we cease from our own works. As we enter into God's faith rest life, we cease from our own works, just as God celebrates his finished works and rest in them. So then we must give our all and be eager to experience this faith rest life, so that no one falls short by following the same pattern of doubt and unbelief. For we have the living word of God, which is full of energy, like a two-mouthed sword. It will even penetrate to the very core of our being, where soul and spirit, bone and marrow meet. It interprets and reveals the true thoughts and secret motives of our heart. There is not one person who can hide their thoughts from God, for nothing we do remains a secret and nothing created is concealed. But everything is exposed and defenseless before his eyes, to whom we must render an account. So then we must cling in faith to all we know to be true. For we have a magnificent king priest, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who rose into the heavenly realm for us and now sympathizes with us in our frailty. He understands humanity, for as a man, our magnificent king priest was tempted in every way, just as we are, and conquered sin. So now we come freely and boldly to where love is enthroned, to receive mercy's kiss and discover the grace we urgently need to strengthen us in our time of weakness. Verse 16, one more time. So now we come freely and boldly to where love is enthroned, to receive mercy's kiss and discover the grace we urgently need to strengthen us in our time of weakness. Look again at verse 6. It says, we still have the opportunity to enter into the faith rest life and experience the fulfillment of the promise. Then again, if you will, skip down to verse 9. So we conclude that there is still a full and complete rest waiting for believers to experience. Verse 10, as we enter into God's faith rest life, we cease from our own works. Yes, Lord. Use that as some framework. Now let's skip to 2 Samuel 7. I'm going to read the first 11 verses here. We'll drink some water first. I got Africa throat. 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 1 says, when King David was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all the surrounding enemies. Let's read that again. We'll go over that verse several times tonight. I want us to see it. When King David was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all the surrounding enemies, the king summoned Nathan the prophet. Look, David said, I'm living in a beautiful cedar palace, but the ark of God is out there in a tent. Nathan replied to the king, go ahead and do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. But that same night, the Lord said to Nathan, go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord has declared. Are you the one to build a house for me to live in? I have never lived in a house. From the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until this very day, I have always moved from one place to another with a tent and a tabernacle as my dwelling. Yet no matter where I have gone with the Israelites, I have never once complained to Israel's tribal leaders, the shepherds of my people Israel. I have never asked them, why haven't you built me a beautiful cedar house? Verse 8, now go say this to my servant David. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone. I have destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I will make your name as famous as anyone who has ever lived on the earth, and I will provide a homeland for my people. I will provide a homeland for my people Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past, starting from the time I appointed judges to rule my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. I love verse 11. Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. Oh, yeah, Lord. Feel the glory of the Lord in here tonight. We have been learning, especially as of late, about entering the realm of resting in confident faith. Entering the realm of resting in confident faith. So faith doesn't remain a thing, but faith actually becomes a realm. Faith is a dimension. It's not a tool that you use to help accomplish a task. Faith is a dimension. Faith is a realm. If it's true that rest is a natural secondary consequence of trust, then it stands as equally true that when we are struggling to trust, the end result of such a struggle will always, and yes, I mean always, be restlessness. You read that again. If it's true that that rest is a natural secondary consequence of trust, then it stands as equally true that when we are struggling to trust, the end result of such a struggle will always, and yes, I mean always, be restlessness. David is extended a magnificent promise in chapter 7, 10 through 11. Let's read it again. May read this half a dozen times before tonight's over with. I will provide a homeland for my people Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past, starting from the time I appointed judges to rule my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies, David. Furthermore, the Lord declares that I'll make a house for you, David, a dynasty of kings. Powerful. David has extended a magnificent promise in chapter 7, 10 through 11. However, let's return to verse 1 and see the posture and environment in which Yahweh chose to release this word to David. Verse 1 again of chapter 7, when the king was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, then this promise comes. David is seated and in rest. And he immediately wants to go into a building program. And at first Nathan says, you know what? Yahweh's so for you. If you want to do that, he'll be fine with it. Then during the night, the word of the Lord comes and says, I don't want you to build me a house. I want to build you a house. I want to make your name great. I want to secure my nation. I want to give them a homestead, and I want your family line to become a dynasty of kings. Settled, the word settled here in the New Living, when King David was settled in his palace, is translated when the king sat in his house in the King James Version. Sat, which is translated settled in the New Living, is the Hebrew word yashab. It's the Hebrew word yashab, and it means to sit down. It means to dwell. It means to abide. Listen to this. It means to be sat by another. To be set by another, it means to inhabit a habitation. To inhabit a habitation. Chiefly, this is what it means, to remain. This was not David sat down for a few minutes. This was David was starting to get settled. David was not in a chair. David was on a throne. David was in a palace, and David was starting to get settled into the seat of authority. David is finally settled into his palace, and as a consequence of that particular posture, Yahweh has given him rest from all his enemies. The synchronicity between being seated and coming into rest from all your enemies is an invaluable revelation. Let's read that again. The synchronicity between being seated and coming into rest from all of your enemies is an invaluable revelation. You cannot wait until things settle down for you to settle down. We all, as leaders, could justify our franticness if we chose to do so. However, faith settles on the inside first and then leverages that interior peace into every chaotic storm around us. He made a choice to sit down. Good choice, Tammy said. Remember when Jesus is coming into the city of Nain, and a large company of people are coming out with a woman whose son is being carried, his coffin's being carried on shoulders. A large crowd of triumph is coming in with Jesus. A large crowd of mourning is moving out of the city, and we see this collision between life and death. Before Jesus does anything to intervene in the woman's situation, before he brings any breakthrough for the son laying in the coffin, the first thing he says to the woman is, "Weep not." He's asking her to get settled and become a vibrational match and recognize that his arrival, his presence on the scene is the promise of an intervention. But phase one for her cannot be that she gets the intervention and the intervention produces rest. That's not faith. Faith is not the inheritance of a promise. Faith is believing in a promise that you've yet to see fulfilled as if it is already fulfilled. So he says to her, "Weep not." Why do you think Yeshua, when he gets ready to raise Jairus' daughter, dismisses all of those people from the room? Because he has no problem doing miracles in front of unbelievers. But he knows if they're going to inherit that perspective, then they have to be a vibrational match for the one who carries resurrection life. Yahweh is inviting people into a particular sacred, holy space unlike I've ever witnessed before at any other point in my life. But you cannot bring your frantic energy in there. You cannot bring your desperation, your emergency thinking, and your chaos into these situations. It's going to require us to come into a place of emotional settledness if we're going to be able to engage the way we need to engage with hope. We must inherit the revelation. Let me say it like this. We must inherit the revelation that to the degree that I will embrace my own being seated will be directly proportionate to the degree of rest that I will inherit from Yahweh. Rest has to do with externals. Seated has to do with the decision to be settled, to settle down, to settle down, to settle down. Look at verse 1 again. David is responsible for his own measure of settledness when King David was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies round about. So we see David is responsible for his own measure of settledness, and Yahweh is the giver of rest. What measure of rest is Abba longing to release if we could just finally, fully fall into our seats? Beloved, identity is the revelation that enables us to be finally and fully seated. It enables us to be liberated from our own efforts of striving in order to earn acceptance, but agreeing with the truth that we are fully loved now and we're being liberated from the religious torment of try harder. We looked at the word seated. David was seated. It's the word yashab. Now let's look at the word rest. The Hebrew word used for rest here is nuwak, and it means to settle down and remain. Remain is present in both words, seated and at rest. To repose, to be quiet. Now this is a very important part of the definition of nuwak. To abandon in order to obtain granted rest. To abandon in order to obtain granted rest. Now here's where we take a wild turn, because David also appears to be at rest when he succumbs to sexual temptation with Bathsheba. Let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 1 says, in the spring of the year, when the kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. She had just completed her purification rites after her menstrual period. Then she returned home. Later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent a message to David saying, I'm pregnant. So David appears to be also at rest when he succumbs to sexual temptation with regards to Bathsheba. The New Living Translation says midday rest. The New King James Version says he arose from his bed. Rest here is the word mishkab. It's not the word nuach. And mishkab means an act of lying on a couch for sleeping and or sexual contact. This rest is not nuach, but mishkab. Why is this so important? Because rest, much like prosperity, must be rescued from our narcissistic Western paradigms of self-indulgence. I better read that again because that sounded like that packed a punch. Why is it important to distinguish between mishkab and nuach? Because rest, much like prosperity, must be rescued from our narcissistic Western paradigms of self-indulgence. Rest is not simply nor exclusively an absence of activity, but rather the abandonment of every other inferior activity in order that we may unreservedly give ourselves to the face-to-face lifestyle of union that we were pre-designed for. Rest is not simply nor exclusively an absence of activity, but rather the abandonment of every other inferior activity in order, and this is so important, when I wrote this in my heart, I just wept in my office, in order that we may unreservedly give ourselves to the face-to-face lifestyle of union that we were pre-designed for. For me, entering rest most certainly included some natural slowing down. However, the focus is not to be simply on what we as leaders need to stop doing, but what we need to be liberated to focus on. Martha, Martha. I contend that one of those things is more challenging to do than the other. And it's way easier to wash dishes and fill up cups than it is to sit at his feet. Because everything you want hidden in you can hide no longer at his feet. Our justified expending of energy, I should say, gets undone when we sit at his feet. We sit at his feet, it's not about our service. Sit at his feet, it's not about our anointing. We sit at his feet, it's not about our accomplishments. When we sit at his feet, we are simply saying, I choose you, and in choosing you, I give you access to look into me in a way I have never been looked into before. And had David done that, it would have dealt with the Bathsheba thing in a way that conquering one more adversary never could. Martha, Martha, one thing is needful. Martha has chosen that better part, and it will not be taken from her. One thing is needful. One thing is needful. One thing is needful. And there's only one thing you will ever do that cannot be taken from you. And it's not fill your building. It's not win your city. It's not get some more followers on social media. It's not sell some more albums. It's not get some more people to download your podcast. It's not raise some more money. And it is not establish another campus. The one thing that cannot be taken from you is when you choose to let him have unlimited ability to examine every aspect of who you are, because in vulnerability, you sit at his feet. One thing is needful. Spiritual apathy precedes all sinful conduct, especially sexual sin. Spiritual apathy precedes all sinful conduct, especially sexual misconduct. Apathy is inevitable for the legalistic mind. Let me say that again. Spiritual apathy is inevitable for the legalistic mind. Beloved, identity stokes and invigorates the fires of this pros face-to-face lifestyle. God's rules were never supposed to stir longing, but his authentic presence will invigorate longing 100% of the time. David settled for an inferior definition of rest, and as a result, David settled for an inferior definition of intimacy. David had multiple wives. Historically, it's believed David had multiple concubines. David could have married, had sex with any woman he wanted to in Israel that was not already married to somebody else. David did not want to have sex. David wanted another conquest. David wanted to have something that belonged to someone else. Why? Because there was not a conquest big enough. There was not an army big enough. There was not a nation big enough to bring fulfillment to David. David was supposed to be seated and at rest. Now, so I'm going to take a big turn here, so you're going to have to work with me, because I'm going to mess with some things you've probably been taught. 2 Samuel 11 again. Spirit man just vibrating up here. I'm telling you, I can't hardly mess with these pages. In the spring of the year, when the kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem, proving to us Israel did not need David to be present in order to be victorious. David is not on the battlefield and Joab is taking care of business. Now, here's where I'm going to hopefully help some leaders tonight. It's in my heart. Many voices that I deeply respect have surmised that David fell into sin with Bathsheba because he should have been off at war. David was supposed to be at war, and had he been at war, as if being at war was going to deal with the internal thing that caused him to have this reaction toward Bathsheba. I vehemently disagree with this assertion that David's sin with Bathsheba is because he should have been at war. I hope I can prove to you tonight he should not have been at war. He should have been seated in his palace in rest, believing the promise of verse 10 and 11. And they say it's because the Bible said that's the time that the kings go off to war. What kings? Israel had only ever had one other one. So you want David to follow the pattern of all of the other kings who think what kings are supposed to do is go to war? This is not, this verse 1 in chapter 11 is not to tell you David should have been at war. It's just telling you what the other kings were doing. And none of those kings had the promise of chapter 7, verse 10 and 11 that says, I'm going to put you at rest. I'm going to give you rest from all your enemies around you. And I'm going to make your family a dynasty of kings. I believe once David had that promise, he should not have been at war. Let me read it again. Many voices that I deeply respect have surmised that David fell into sin with Bathsheba because he should have been off at war. I vehemently disagree with this assertion. What kings were off at war? Oftentimes the question for you and I of what we should be doing is coming by studying other leaders. In essence, we would be saying, had David been busy, he wouldn't have sinned. And I'm saying the opposite. Had David been engaging with presence as the beloved of Abba, he would have been at rest, and that's where liberty from sin comes from, not busyness and warfare. I was not doing morally better when I was busier. True. Traveling all over the place, staying in hotels, being on airplanes, jet setting, swinging my sword, defeating enemies, changing the world. Yet so unfulfilled that I found myself susceptible to things I knew were not even really in my heart. But being unfulfilled can make you make some strange decisions. I've sat with, unfortunately, leader after leader after leader in my life that have fallen into sexual sin. I have not sat with one yet that I believe had a problem with lust, but 100% of them had a problem with fulfillment. Therefore, they needed a conquest. Therefore, they needed to be desired. Therefore, they needed to be wanted. And I've been in those shoes myself. I say that in great vulnerability, but it's true. When you don't know how dearly Abba loves you, you'll seek for someone to give you affection and attention and affirmation. But once you get seated in beloved identity, it is no longer relevant what anybody else thinks about you. I refuse to say that had David been busy, he would not have sinned. And I'm saying the opposite. Had David been engaging with presence as the beloved of Abba, he would have been at rest, and that's where liberty from sin comes from, not busyness and warfare. Maybe the kings who all went off to war were kings that did not have the promise of 2 Samuel 7:10 through 11. Maybe they should have been off at war, but David should not have been. Quit living like every other leader that does not have your promise. Remember Hebrews 4, the promise should always produce rest. Katapausis is the Greek word for rest in Hebrews 4. I'm fully convinced that verse 10 and 11, this is important. Are you good? Yes. I'm fully convinced that verse 10 and 11 were not words given to David for which he should have heard them and then continued with business as usual. No, I believe the promise of verse 10 and 11 was an offering of David to take a turn in the road he was on. Effectively a release from swinging his sword to raising his sons. And he missed this turn because he would not allow himself to be re-identified. Let's look at the verses again. I said we were going to do this many times. I just think it's important that we reiterate this. Let's look at verse 9 too, because Yahweh says to him, I've been with you wherever you have gone, and I have destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I make your name as famous as anyone who has ever lived on the earth. And I will provide a homeland for my people Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past, starting from the time I appointed judges to rule my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. I believe this is an invitation for David to turn away from the sword and to become the man of presence he was designed to be, and ultimately the father in his own home that he was called to be. David is wanting to conquer nations and build a temple. God is wanting David to come into rest, trust the provision of God, watch this, and have his sons become the dynasty of kings for Israel. Remember, sin, hamartia, ha, with or negative, and meros, those two words together where we get hamartia, means form or design. So in sin, in essence, is to live apart from the rhythm and blueprint of our design. Look what David does immediately after the promise in chapter 7. If you look into the promise of chapter 7, the Lord gives him that promise. Finishes the promise in verse 16. So Nathan goes back and tells David everything. And then David goes into this long, amazing prayer of thanksgiving throughout the end of chapter 7. Look at the first words of chapter 8. After this, David defeated and subdued the Philistines by conquering Gath, the largest town. David also conquered the land of Moab, and the people lie down on the ground in a row. And he measured them off in groups with a length of rope. He measured off 2 groups to be executed for every one where he spared, and they became David's subjects, paid him tribute money. The next verse, David's in another fight. The next verse, David's in another fight. The next verse, David's in another. The entire chapter 8, which is in chronological order. I looked at this today. That's why it says after this. After what? After the promise and the prayer of thanksgiving, you know what David does? Nothing different than David had been doing before he received that promise. He goes right back into slaying enemies. He goes right back into swinging his sword. We know through chapter 11 that he did not have to physically be present for them to win. Yahweh was the one who was bringing them victory. David wanted to be present. David wanted to swing his sword. David wanted the accolades and the praise and the admiration of the people that came when he came riding back into the city with his bloody sword saying, see, I did it once again. And Yahweh is saying to him, you would do me a lot more good if you'd learn to stay seated. If you'd accept the re-identification that comes with the promise that I'm trying to make you the progenitor of a dynastic line. Which one of those is more important? Killing a few more of your enemies or becoming the progenitor of a dynastic line? We're going to go a little further. You got time? You good? Quit living like every other leader. I believe David was effectively being offered to be freed from swinging his sword and liberated to raise his sons. And he missed this turn because he could not allow himself to be misidentified. Let me summarize chapter 8. David captured 1,000 chariots, 7,000 charioteers, 20,000 foot soldiers. He crippled all the chariot horses except for enough to use 100 chariots. He then killed 22,000 Arameans from Damascus. He kills 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of the Salt. The Bible said the Lord made David victorious. And I'm here to tell you tonight, this is where my personal story comes in. He did the same for me. I did not leave the system because we weren't being successful. I left the system because there was no long path revelation that had the ability to bring fulfillment. And how do I know David's victories weren't bringing fulfillment? Bathsheba is proof that David's victories were not bringing fulfillment. The Lord made David victorious. He did the same for me. I did not leave the religious system because I was failing there, but rather because those victories, even when the Lord granted them, did not bring the hoped for fulfillment. The chapter right before the Bathsheba incident is recorded, says David killed 73,000 foot soldiers. Yet we still get the Bathsheba story. He had to kill more. He had to conquer more. He had to kill more. He had to conquer more. He had to kill more. He had to conquer more. And at no point in time were those victories causing what needed to be fixed on the inside of him to actually ever get fixed. But when he was at rest and settled in his kingdom, that's when he began to inherit the promises. The promises are not to accentuate our busyness. The promises are to settle us and give us grace to slow down so we can make the turn in the road. We are being called to model leadership in a way the church has never seen leaders lead before, out of rest. I say David should have taken the turn in the road that was mysteriously embedded in the promise of 2 Samuel 7:10 through 11. David was a mighty man in war, and he had allowed measurable success to become his chief source of identity, and he lost his ability to simply trust in Yahweh's presence and in Yahweh's promise. And David is, outside of Yeshua, one of my greatest personal heroes in all of the Bible. This is not a slam against David. This is taking David's life as a template and saying, how did his family go off the rails? Because we're going to get there in a minute, and they went off the rails. And the promise was about his family. Go back to the promise. It's about a homestead and sons. But David didn't give his attention to a homestead and sons. David kept with the busyness of business as usual and said, I must be able to swing a sword because I'm good at it. Being good at something is not how you decide what you're called to do. Fulfillment, rest, joy, peace. That's how you determine what you're called to do. David's missing the turn in the road is unfortunately evidenced in the massive perversion and dysfunction in his sons. Because the scripture does, I'm going to scratch the surface on some of the dysfunction within David's family. David has a daughter by the way of his third wife, Maach, named Tamar, who is raped by her brother, David's son, Amnon. Tamar is raped by Amnon, whose brother is Absalom. Absalom murders Amnon. Absalom attempts to steal David, his father's throne. Then he gets hung up in a tree by his hair, and Joab stabs him to death. Then toward the end of his life, David has another son named Adonijah, who also comes to try to take the throne before David is able to hand the throne over to Solomon. This does not sound like a family of dynastic kings. Does this sound like what Yahweh promised in 2 Samuel 7, 10 through 11, when Yahweh says to David that he will build him a house, that he will make him a dynasty, that he will cause subsequent generations to be kings? This is not the fulfillment of the fullness of what I believe was being offered to David. I believe David would have had to remain seated, come into rest, stay home, and train his sons in how to do presence instead of how to jockey for position. David received a promise while at rest, and that promise should have been the generator of even greater rest, but David could not break free from his previous identification as a warrior. I'm glad we didn't stay in war because we were good at it, because we were. But it wasn't bringing fulfillment. It led to another battle and another battle and another battle and another battle. The promise is an invitation for us as much as it was an invitation for David to leave all inferior sources of identification and to exchange the striving we have been stuck in for the seeking adventure we were born for. To exchange the striving we have been stuck in for the seeking adventure we were actually born for. Rest is not the consequence of a promise fulfilled, but rather the consequence of a promise given and believed in. Remember Hebrews 4, Yahweh expected Israel to enter rest by no other means except an unwavering trust that Yahweh could not do what he said. Didn't matter how impossible it looked, he had spoken a thing. And he expected them, but in the Old Testament, he expected them to enter into the rest. They could not do it. He's now giving this admonition in Hebrews 4 to the current church as well as to you and I to say, you must ensure that you enter into rest. And rest is an unwavering trust in the faithfulness of the one who made the promise. Amen? Hebrews 11 says concerning Sarah that the authority of her faith rested in the one who made the promise, and she tapped into his faithfulness. The authority of her faith rested in the faithfulness of the one who made the promise, and the key was to tap into his faithfulness, not her faith. Hallelujah. Once he has made the promise, for you and I to fail to enter rest communicates that we are wrestling to be fully seated within two revelations. Number one, he who promised is faithful. Number two, our own beloved identity as it relates to his care and concern for us. He will watch over his word to perform it. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 copper coins, and yet it does not go unnoticed by your Father in heaven? Are you not more valuable than the sparrows? What we do not need is more faith in our faith, but rather unshakable faith in his faithfulness. What we do not need is more faith in our faith, but rather unshakable trust in his faithfulness. Had David fully trusted the promise, he could have become a present father for his sons. And this could have been the means whereby the insecurities in David's sons would have been healed. David's sons were filled with envy and striving for self-promotion, not to mention lust. David's obsession with war generated an orphan spirit in his sons and kept them from being secure enough to celebrate the promotion of another. If we as fathers do not become seated and at rest, we will never be able to offer our sons the rest that keeps them from jockeying for position. I have the most uncommon group of spiritual sons I've ever seen. And Tammy continually says the great witness of the health of the family is the interpersonal relationship between the brothers who, when one succeeds, the other doesn't become envious. When one succeeds, the other doesn't try to tear him down. When one succeeds, the other doesn't come into insecurity. Why? Because what fathers are supposed to do is free us from the orphan spirit that causes us to believe we have to be first in line in order to be loved. You know, it doesn't matter if your church is growing or shrinking. I could not be more loved than I am loved right now. And I'm not going to use measurables to define my worth. My identity as a son is where my worth comes from. And I believe David could have dealt with that in his sons had he been present, but he was still being misidentified by his proficiency at wielding a sword. David is one of my great personal heroes, yet I believe his unwillingness to remain seated and release a word of authority cost his family desperately. So my main question tonight, and I only have a couple of more pages, my main question tonight, David, is what did you do with that harp? Where did you hang that thing up? It was so powerful that you could sit and play that harp, and evil, tormenting spirits that had been assigned to the king of Israel would depart from him, and he would come into rest. And somewhere along the line, the parade line got so long, and the song, Saul has slain his thousands, and David had slain his 10,000s, got so loud that David forgot the sweet, subtle sound of the harp that had the ability to change frequencies and atmospheres and literally create such an atmosphere of worship that darkness could not even stand. My question for David is my question for every one of us in this room. What did we do with our harps? It's time to put our swords down and pick up our harps again. I feel that by the word of the Lord. It's time to put our swords down and pick up our harps again. And remember that under a superior covenant, even the sword is a word. If we really believed that we could move mountains with our words, would we still be swinging swords in self-effort? Seeking in worship is an invitation repeatedly extended to the kingdom man throughout all of Scripture. Being liberated from striving for success and achievement is where we find the grace to be re-identified as first worshipers, living for the adventure of seeking his face and discovering that true fulfillment is only ever found right here. Pros, face to face. I could fill an itinerary for years right now. I could go right back on the road right now without having to stretch. I could fill up an itinerary. If I thought that's what the earth needs, that's right where I'd be doing. And I feel less inclined to do that right now than I ever have at any other stage in my life. But being seated right here in this homestead where we're able to release a word, where we're able to release a frequency, where sons have got harps in their hands and we're coming together to steward presence, it's doing more for the earth than it would do if right now we went out and got in hand-to-hand combat with a bunch of darkness because we believe what we were supposed to spend our energy doing is fighting darkness. I'm going to spend my energy hosting presence and raising sons. Hosting presence and raising sons. Releasing the grace for a the next generation to never have to hang their harps up, but to always keep your harps in your hands. To always keep first worshipers as the new definition of what it means to be a leader. Let me read this again. Seeking in worship is an invitation that is repeatedly extended to the kingdom man throughout Scripture. Being liberated from striving for success and achievement is where we find the grace to be re-identified as first worshipers, living for the adventure of seeking His face and discovering that true fulfillment is only found right here. I consider this seeking adventure to be the great privilege of my life. I consider this seeking adventure to be the great privilege of my life. Experiencing more of Abba's love is the adventure we were born for, and restlessness is the enemy of this pros lifestyle of joy, peace, and yes, adventure. What measure of rest would we be operating in right now if we really believed what He had promised? If we really believed it, we'd get our harps back out. Get our harps back out. One of those is sexier than the other. Swinging swords and putting on armor and doing man shit. Yeah, let's be real. Got this little man syndrome posing as masculinity. We forgot how to play a harp. We forgot how to be tender. Oh, forgot how to sit at His feet. We need to accomplish something. We need to conquer something. We need to do something for God. Yet we find ourselves getting off couches enticed by stuff that we shouldn't be enticed by, interested in looking at things we shouldn't be looking at, going places we shouldn't be going, and the whole time we're wondering, what is the problem? You think you need to fight more, or you think you need to remember where you hung your harp up? Go back into that place where you give your heart so fully to Him, there's no room or space for you to give yourself to anything else. In Mobile, I got my harp back out. I realized it was okay for me to just be what I was in the beginning, which was a worshiper. Before I ever found out I was a speaker, right? Before I knew that I could succeed, before I knew I was a teacher, I was a worshiper. And you probably were too. Not a worship leader, a worshiper. Not a worship pastor, a worshiper. Not a pastor who worships on Sunday morning, but a worshiper day and night, night and day and night. We're going to get our harps out again, and nobody's going to go, oh, thank God they've got their harps out. They're mighty harp players. There's no such thing as a mighty harp player. Yet there is. Because the might of the ones who have become tender again in His presence are the ones that can hear the whispers of how to raise up a dynasty of kings. Seeking in worship is an invitation repeatedly extended to the kingdom man throughout Scripture. Being liberated from striving for success and achievement is where we find the grace to be re-identified as first worshipers. Living for the adventure of seeking His face and discovering that true fulfillment is only ever really found here. I consider this seeking adventure to be the great privilege of my life. Experiencing more of Abba's love is the adventure we were born for, and restlessness is the enemy of this pros lifestyle of joy, peace, and yes, I say again, adventure. What measure of rest would we be operating in right now if we really believed what Abba had promised us would indeed come to pass? Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. In essence, rest is inviting every one of us as leaders to abandon every inferior pursuit in order to fully give our hearts to this pros face-to-face lifestyle. Beloved, identity is the generator of all authentic rest. Having faith in the depths of Abba's love towards us changes our lives in an unimaginable way, such a way that we naturally enter into nuach, rest. In rest, we find David inheriting the glorious promise concerning his homestead being in peace and his sons becoming a dynastic family of kings. Once rest causes you to inherit a generational promise, live like you have a promise. Pray like you have a promise. Lead like you have a promise. Praise like you have a promise. And yes, rest like you have a promise. Rest like you have a promise. Our call tonight is to a realm of rest that enables us to hear a word that is inviting us to become the seed of generational legacy. Here's the glorious thing about the promise of Yahweh. It all came to pass for David, but I don't think he had to attend so many of his children's funerals in order for it to come to pass. I don't think he had to have one son raping one daughter and one son murdering one son and another son trying to steal the throne until he had to be killed by Joab and another son rising up, and you got dysfunction after dysfunction. And unfortunately, even in our culture, that has become par for leaders. And it does not have to be that way. That promise God gave you was not something he intended to step back and make you go achieve on your own. That promise God gave you is a word he is watching over to perform. He who has begun a good work in you is faithful and just to complete it. Heaven and earth may pass away, but the word of the Lord will stand forever. He's asking us to believe like that, to lead like that, to father our families like that, to treat our marriages like that. And all of a sudden we find ourselves in this vibrational frequency that is the synchronicity with the heart of God, that is filled with joy and peace. And all of a sudden our kids want to be in the middle of the house of God, not because they have a call on their life and they don't want to be in disobedience, but because there's nowhere else they'd rather be, because this is the fountainhead of joy in their lives. Thank you, Lord. Our call tonight is to a rest that enables us to hear a word that is inviting us to become the seed of generational legacy. A dynasty of kings for David that Yeshua himself would come through. This is where the restlessness is no longer permitted to push us into striving. David was divinely intended to become the progenitor of a royal dynasty, a dynasty of kings sitting on thrones, not swinging swords. Ask Solomon which one's more beneficial, because he never picked up a sword in his life. Ty, you mind jumping up there, buddy? I just think we're supposed to end this with our harps tonight. I'm just going to read this the way I have it written down. I see a coming group of leaders with harps in their hands. And they're going to begin to shine in unimaginable ways. We will affect the darkness in ways that swinging swords never could. So I say to you tonight, you are the coming group of leaders that are going to remember where you hung your harp. Remember what it was like before all of the responsibilities. Remember what it was like before you were counting people and counting offerings. Just remember what it was like when it was enough for you to say he's watching over his word to perform it. And the call for me is get my harp out again. We could be liberated from the applause and the reaction of the crowd, so that we could be moved once again to be identified by strumming our harps. We could hear a promise that says, I have secured you. I have seated you in your homestead. You are safe from all your enemies round about, and now you can begin to turn your heart toward the next generation that is going to be a dynasty of kings, a dynastic family. I speak over this extended family, and I say we are becoming a dynastic family that begins to think in terms of the dynasty of the burning hearts of the coming generations. We're going to be able to be present fathers and present mothers in the lives of the next generation, because we don't live to achieve more. We don't live to conquer more. We come more deeply into the seat of rest tonight. We play our harps and we trust. You deal with the enemies. The battle is not mine, but the battle belongs to the Lord. If no weapon that is formed against me will be able to prosper, then instead of forming a weapon to face a weapon, I fashion a harp to strum in the glory of worship and find that your presence is my source of fulfillment. For every leader dealing with unfulfillment in the room that's been confused by believing if we were more successful in ministry, we'd be more fulfilled, I break that lie off of their hearts right now. May they know that true fulfillment comes by way of presence, face-to-face communion, hearts that burn day and night and night and day. I want to sit at your feet. I want to drink from the cup in your hand. Yahweh, I believe this new age you've brought us into is calling for a turn in the road. That this turn in the road as we enter into the age of glory. Yes, for the age of glory is upon us. And as we enter into this age of glory that you've designed for us, I declare there's grace to slow down, to come into rest and make the turn of re-identification. To remember, first we played our harps. When we didn't care who was in the building, we played our harps. When we didn't care that there was more people this week than there was last week, we just played our harps. When we weren't counting and giving a census, we were just playing our harps. I want to be a harp player in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. One thing have I desired, after that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in His temple. To behold the beauty of the Lord, to inquire in His temple. I remember a David who didn't even trust in swords. I remember when David used to throw rocks from a distance and believe that it was enough. Then we find him engaged in hand-to-hand combat he was never born for. You're going to play your harps and Yahweh's going to release an airstrike on your behalf. You're not even going to have to get bloody on this one. When Yahweh looks at David and says there's too much blood on your hands to build the temple, it's not a compliment. He's not complimenting him because of his bloodshed. He's saying you didn't have to get that bloody. I would have done it for you if you'd have just kept your harp in your hand. I hear the Lord saying to somebody, if you'll pick your heart back up, I'll take care of your enemies for you. I'll conquer your enemies for you if you'll just pick your heart back up. So all over this room right now, I want us to pick our harps back up. You're leaders, so it should not take a lot of encouragement. Move around the room if you need to. I want you to get your harps back up and remember what the first love frequency sounded like for you. Just begin to lift your voices. I purposefully cut this short tonight so that we can pick our harps back up. I don't want us to hear this word. I want us to do it tonight. I want us to do it together tonight.
Yahweh, we embrace the turn in the road tonight. We're going to believe the promise. We're going to enter into rest. We're going to get our harps back out.